everyone, so welcome to today's lunchtime lesson. We're doing I was going to say grammar focus, but I would again really call this a vocabulary focus with some aspects of grammar. And we're going to be talking about modals of deduction today. So if you remember, a few weeks ago we did a lunchtime lesson on modal verbs of obligation. And I thought it might be useful just to quickly go over again what a modal verb is. So if you remember, it's these special types of verbs which change or affect the main verbs in a sentence. Yeah. And we have lots of different functions for modal verbs. So they can be talking about possibility, ability, obligation, or permission. In the last lesson, we talked about how we can use them to talk about obligation. And they also behave quite differently from what we would call an ordinary or your main verb in a sentence. So we are going to focus today on modal verbs that we can use to talk about speculation or deduction. Okay, so you'll see both words used quite a lot, but basically we're using these verbs to express how sure we are that something is true or something is possible. Yeah. Okay, so just take a minute and think individually, what modal verbs would you use to talk about speculation or deduction? Take a second to think about it. You can write some in the chat box for me. And we're just talking about modal verbs here, yeah? Not other ways to speculate, just specifically modal verbs. Okay. Might, yeah, may. Good. So I wouldn't use can, Manushka, but I would use can't or couldn't. And I wouldn't use should. I think should we would use more for like possibility, like it should be there, but it's not, right? Or obligation. The ones that, let's have a look at the ones that I've chosen. So the important thing to remember with these modal verbs is that we're thinking about how sure you are that something is true or something is possible, right? The four main modals that we use for this are must, might and may, and can't. Yeah, we can also use couldn't. You'll also see that sometimes in the past. But those are the four main ones. Okay, so the way that we're thinking about the modals of deduction or speculation has to be different from how we think about the modals of obligation. So remember when we looked at the modals of obligation, we put them on a scale from like 100% to 0%. So we said there's 100% obligation and there's no obligation. When we're thinking about speculation, it's got to be different. You can't think of them as opposites, okay? So you have to think about in terms of how possible they are and how impossible they are, yeah? But if we look at these, we're still thinking about 100%, right? So if I say something is 100% possible or if something is 100% impossible, the intensity is the same. We're just talking about slightly different things. So for 100% possible, I would use must. For 50%, I would use might or may. And if I'm 100% sure that something is impossible, I would use can't. Okay, so some common mistakes that happen with modals of speculation or deduction. Please remember that pure modals, so those are things like must, might, can't, they are never followed with to. I don't say it must to be true. Yeah, it's followed by what we call a bare infinitive. So there's no to, so it must be true. Okay? Don't use could when we're talking about speculation. So this is also a common mistake. It's not a terrible communicative issue, okay? People will understand, but you're actually expressing something a bit different. If I say it could be John, what I'm really doing here is I'm making a hypothetical statement, right? If I say it could be John if he weren't in Spain, this is part of a second conditional which I'm using to hypothesize about the present. It's not really the same as saying it might be John, where I'm saying it's 50% possible. Okay, so these are slightly different things. And don't overuse the modal may. So I usually hear my students using may instead of might. Okay, so I looked on the Longman Dictionary corpus to show you some examples of may and also some examples of might. And if you look at these in detail, you'll see that the may examples are generally more formal than the ones that we're using for might. Okay, you can go onto Longman and type them in, guys, and see them in more detail. But yeah, if you look at how we're using these verbs, might is more commonly used in more neutral to informal registers and in more conversational English. So if you're speaking, try and use might instead of may when we're talking about how possible you think something is. A big difference with modals of speculation compared to modals of obligation is that we can actually use these in a past aspect. So do you remember when we talked about modals of obligation, you couldn't say, when I was at school, I must wear a uniform. I had to use have to because I could put that in the past, right? When I was at school, I had to wear a uniform. But we can actually use these four modals when they're functioning as modals of speculation with a past aspect. And that functioning is really important. Okay, remember, context is key. Language without context isn't language. So if I'm using these in a function to express speculation, I can express past aspect with them. And I'll do that by using my modal verb, then have, and then the participle. So it would look like this. Yeah, I must have left my keys at home. So I'm referring to something which happened in the past. Okay. But, and this is important, guys, you need to think about your pronunciation with these modals, right? If we're using past modals. This is a great pronunciation challenge for you. So when we are making these sentences, the auxiliary verb have is not important. Yeah, it's not conveying meaning, which means when we're speaking quickly and fluently, this verb contracts and we use the weak vowel sound, the schwa, instead of the strong vowel sound. So instead of have, it's going to become of. Yeah. So it must have been him. We're going to make a block of sound with these verbs here, must have been. We're going to think of this as one word, okay? One sound, sorry, not one word, one sound. And it's going to change from must have been to must have been. Yeah. So that whole sentence will form our nice block of sound. It must have been him. The same over here. It might have been him. Or it may have been him. And finally, it can't have been him. Okay? These contractions, working with these contractions, remember, the reason that it's really important for you to use them isn't so much for your communication, because people will understand you. If you say it can't have been him, they will understand what you're saying. The reason we have to use them is because of your listening. Because if you listen to L1 speakers of English, so people who speak English as their first language, we always make these contractions, okay, when we're speaking quickly and fluently. if you are able to produce a sound, you can hear a sound. So if you can make that contraction, you will understand people better when they're speaking to you. Because it sounds very different, right? It must have been him, it must have been him, are very different sounds. And if we're not working with them, it creates problems for us understanding others. Those are the 4 modal verbs we use for speculating, but obviously that's very limiting with your language because we're only looking at 4 things. Yeah, there's lots of other ways that we can speculate in English that will make your English more interesting and quite often make you sound a bit more natural. If you're doing any exams in English, speculation is one of the areas that candidates always forget to include in their language. And it's something that the examiners are always looking for. So this kind of vocabulary is brilliant for you in terms of your exam because it's going to boost your marks, okay? And also, if you just think about how you speak in general in your own language, speculation is such a big part of the functions that you need to express. Okay, so some alternatives that we can use here, guys. If we start, first of all, with some adjectives that we can use for speculation. So we have 2 adjectives here, bound to and sure to. Yeah, these have the same meaning. They're both adjectives, and we are always following them with an infinitive, but this time we do use to because they're not modal verbs. Okay. So if I say that something is bound to happen or sure to happen, it means that I am certain it is true. Remember, when we're talking about speculation, we are certain with the information that we have. Of course, there's a possibility it might not happen. Yeah, but with the information you have, you're expressing how sure you are. Okay. Another one that we can use, guys, is be likely to. Yeah, or in negative, be unlikely to. We've got 2 different examples here. You have be likely to, or starting with what we call this dummy subject, okay? It is likely or unlikely that, and a clause. So there's 2 different ways that you can structure these. So likely and unlikely, guys, are adjectives, not adverbs. Just because something ends in ly, it doesn't automatically mean that it is an adverb, right? Watch out for that. So in the first examples here, what we're using is the subject, okay, he, then be likely to or unlikely to, and then the infinitive, okay? The other option is if we begin with it, this dummy subject, okay, it is likely or unlikely that, and you'll continue with a clause, right? So remember, a clause is a group of independent words that has meaning, yeah, but it doesn't form a sentence. So for example, the government will raise interest rates this year. This is a clause. Okay. And then some adverbs that we can use for speculation. And this is such a great way to speculate. And it's something that I never hear, or I don't usually hear students produce, are the words definitely, okay, and probably. Yeah. And these are 2 brilliant words to bring into your speaking and your writing, which are not complicated to use, but I don't usually hear students using them. Okay. So these are both adverbs. Please be careful of the position of where they go. So the mistake that people usually make is that you start your sentence and you say, probably he won't be here until 8:15, or definitely she'll pass the exam. Yeah, they're not adverbs of comment. Adverbs of comment, like luckily, unfortunately, funnily enough, those ones go at the beginning of a sentence. But these ones are speculating and they have a different position. So they will go before the main verb, right? So if we look at that first example here, pass is the main verb, yeah? And this is where it's going to go, definitely, okay? And after the auxiliary, if we have an auxiliary like here, okay? If it's a negative sentence like here, okay, they will go before the auxiliary, right? So if it's positive, before the main verb. If it's negative, before the auxiliary verb. Okay. With the verb to be, all right? They go after in positive sentences, yeah, and in before in negative sentences. He probably won't be here. He'll probably be here, okay? Just to say, guys, as well, be likely to and probably are very similar in meaning. The meaning is, and the intensity is the same, but be likely to is a more formal tone and register. So be likely to is a great one to bring into your written English, for example, and probably is a great one to bring into your spoken English. Of course, it depends what you're writing. Yeah, but if we're writing an essay, be likely to look better than probably. So in terms of exams, okay, if you're taking an exam, the very obvious that you can speculate if you're doing a Cambridge exam is in the photo description, okay? And if you look at the photo descriptions, that task, it actually asks you to speculate because it always says, what might the people be doing or how might the people be feeling, okay? So that's one place that you should definitely be bringing in your language for speculation. The other place, of course, that works great is in part 3 and part 4 of the Cambridge exams when you're doing the group task, where you're speaking about which is the better option. And in the part 4 discussion, you should bring language of speculation in as well because it just makes your language so much richer and it shows that you're able to analyze a topic, okay? In terms of writing, it can be brought in so many different areas. It works fantastically in proposals and reports, in essays, and also in informal writing as well. Okay, so it's you could definitely be talking in, for example, a letter to a friend. There's so many opportunities there to bring in language for speculation. So my challenge for you this week is to try and bring in language of speculation as much as possible into any English that you're producing, okay? So if you're going to make a sentence, think about if there is space for you to use some of the language that we've talked about today. But push yourself as well, challenge yourself. So if you're already comfortable with using those modal verbs, let's try and work with some of the expressions we talked about today. Let's try and use sure to, and let's try and use probably, and let's try and use be likely to as well.